when it comes out into the world, it's hit with all this sensory overload, and then it starts to develop at a huge rate.
Our children need to play for longer. And that's those gross motor skills, which is developing the right hemisphere first.
And they're the foundations to social, emotional, behavioral regulation.
Then go on to the left hemispheres, and then the left and the right hemisphere will develop together. They don't need to be doing maths and phonics and things before the age of 3, because that's left hemispheric skills. We don't need our children in front of screens.
Individuals with dyslexia, they really struggle academically. They lack the left hemispheric skills. You look at kids with ADHD, autism, are very left hemispherically driven.
In a more sedentary world overflowing with screens, stress and processed foods, our brains are under constant pressure, especially those of our children. Brains Under Attack is a podcast that exposes modern environments and teaches us how to build healthy brains in an unhealthy world. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the BrainX pod. We're the team behind BrainX Movement. Now, it's clear to see that in 2025, parenting is tougher than it ever was before. It's the most important job you're ever going to have, and probably right now it's the most difficult job you're ever going to have. So in this episode, we're going to try and discuss and get across how a brain should develop, the process a brain goes through, and some of the ways in which development goes off track. Do we want to talk firstly maybe about the biology of the brain? What happens pre-birth, Seb?
Absolutely. So basically the brain has been given all the cells it possibly needs in the at conception. So conception happens, and then within the first 20 weeks of gestation, all the cells are developed in the brain. It then takes the next stage, which is neuronal migration. The cells have their own destiny sort of location points. And then it moves on to the next stage when the child starts to go into the third trimester between 28 and 40 weeks. Then what happens is it starts to create this synaptogenesis. The cells start to create connections. They start to signal one another, start to communicate with one another when the child has been stimulated. The important thing about the brain is these cells can only connect to a certain level. There's a limitation. So it's almost like a neurological compromise, because although we have one of the largest brains, we also have one of the smallest birth canals. So the brain can only ever really reach around 25% of synaptic and myelination development. If it was bigger, couldn't really fit through the birth canal. Nature's incredible in the way it's designed our brains, and that's how our brains begin to form. Then when it comes out into the world, then it's hit with all this sensory overload, and then it starts to develop at a huge rate, the fastest between 0 and 2 years old. So we have the primitive brain, the medulla oblongata, and then we have the postural reflexes start to develop into the pons. And then we have the midbrain, which is where the sensory cortex and the motor cortex start to communicate and develop. So it creates more higher advanced movements, which then develops the speech, and then the ability to sing and to read and to walk and to talk and to do all them things. And then that's when it develops the prefrontal lobes, the front part of the brain. Mm-hmm. So the first 2 years creates significant growth. And even in gestation, there is an element of growth, but it has to be limited to that 25%. And then when it comes into the world, that is when it's really important in how we stimulate that child, because them cells then start connecting and start myelinating through repetition of behavior, repetition of nutrition, hydration, sleep, because this is when the immune system is immature, the digestive system is immature, the child has no teeth, breathing is rapid. So we have to nurture this child to be able to train it almost. And we've got to do that with understanding the blueprint of development.
On that one then, Seb, so it's amazing. There's a blueprint and there is a step-by-step process, isn't there? So if we then talk about the optimal route of brain development, so from conception through pregnancy and things like that. So our babies, and we know this, are already developing during pregnancy, of course. But their brain is also developing what it's preparing to come into, isn't it? So the
Yeah, so
baby
it's
will
yeah,
prepare itself to whatever it thinks it's coming out to. So this is where it's super, super important, and you can explain more around how our mothers to be are from a physical point of view, an emotional point of view, from a stress point of view. Are we overworking? Are they relaxed? Are husband and wives to be and things like that, are they supporting the mother who's about to give birth? We've got to be really, really mindful that that child's already preparing itself to what it's coming out to. So again, there's a blueprint of how the brain develops, but we've got to support that along the whole journey, haven't we?
yes, because myelination or synaptic connections will only respond to a stimulus. So the nurture of the mother and the support of the mother in them stages are absolutely crucial. The baby is almost being communicated to in a way for it to align itself to what it believes it's coming out to. And that's how we create these synaptic connections and this myelination process.
And we know that regarding either alcohol and smoking and things like that we're told we shouldn't do that because that's going to affect the baby. But also mummy's thoughts processes, her emotional state, how she's relaxing, that's all plays an effect as well, which we don't talk about. So mummies are now working more than ever before, which is absolutely fine, no problem. But when our mummies are pregnant and are going through that stage, we have to recognize that we are going to affect baby whatever we do, whether that's great things or not so good things. So working, too much stress, overload of any kind of nutritional things, it's really, really important that we understand that this is playing a role. So the healthier we can be at conception obviously gives that child the better start from a neurological brain development point of view.
If you get the foundations in order, difficulties reduce, probabilities of challenges sort of reduce as well in terms of immune system responses, food sensitivities, mental health issues, postural dysfunctions. So we start to reduce the possibilities of then further developing these dysfunctions or asymmetries, as we call them, or underdeveloped areas.
When I was early in my journey with this information, what actually quite helped a lot was that you can be more dominant one side of the brain than the other, and
most of us are.
Different sides of the brain are in charge of different bodily
unique
functions,
behaviors,
controls, the way you view the world,
immune system regulation, digestive, food sensitivities.
You know, I think it's been proven now that certain disorders come out from being more dominant one side or more dominant the other. How does, you know, the growth of the brain, and how does the brain become more dominant, you know, than the other side of the brain, and how does that impact
all the factors that we explained, all the factors
from the growth? Yeah, but if you know, if I'm not moving right, well, why does one side grow?
Well,
and technology plays a bit
let
of
me
this.
Explain. Yeah, let me explain then quick. So what happens is, now in neuroscience, this is obviously we all know this to be true because there's a lot of evidence now. There's a lot of research and peer-reviewed research as well. So you know, you'd get people who ask me, well, is it peer-reviewed? Well, every research has to be peer-reviewed before it's even published. I'm not going to share unpublished peer-reviewed studies, am I? So what happens is you get these silly questions from academics who have no clue on brain science, but they're in sort of brain neurology, or they're in, you know, neuroscience, let's say. So what happens is when the brain's growing, remember, we've only got gross motor skills. That's only a right hemispheric skill. They're the regions that predominantly reside in the right hemisphere, although there's some in the left, but there's very little in the left. There's more on the right. Now, the reason why the right hemisphere grows is because all the gross motor skills reside in that right hemisphere, and it helps with the engaging these large muscles for the child to be able to connect with itself, to be able to integrate and put these primitive reflexes to sleep, in order to then, for the first 0 to 3 years, maybe 2.5 for some, depending on how much they were stimulated in movement. But around 2.5, 3, Steve, what then happens, and you can even see this in expression of language, if any parent is listening to this, at around 3 years old, the child then starts to ask you the questions like, why, daddy? Why, mummy? And they constantly try to break up the world because now the left hemisphere is kicking in. So now you start to see the integration on this development of fine motor skills starting to come into play. You start to see individual reading coming into play, but they won't have them skills during the right hemisphere's growth. But what some parents would do, Steve, is they would encourage them to read earlier. They would encourage them to sit in a screen that prevents them from moving these large muscles, so gross motor skills don't develop. So what happens is you interfere with the blueprint of brain development. This isn't just something I've made up, but I've always said this. I'm about 20 years ahead in neuroscience because I was on a desperate journey to for the responsibility for my children. But also this pod, if there was any way of encouraging any parent, is, and you've got children, if your children ever then want to listen to this to understand brain development because they're going to have children of their own, this is why we do it, to make sure that the environment doesn't change their learning of the blueprint. And that's why I think it's important we get this message out. But that's how the brain develops. There's a blueprint to it. These skills are not, you're not going to get fine motor control. You're not going to understand speech and language communication of these words in the beginning. You're not going to have full hearing, full vision. You've got to develop them in sequence. And movement allows you to do that. The environment allows you to do that.
I think that's really important, isn't it? That we've got to, so in the first stages of life, the right hemisphere skills need to develop. They need to develop first, and then the left hemispheres kick in. Or what's happening now because of tech and screen time and the world's certainly in the Western world,
developing towards left hemisphere.
We are, because
logic.
But logic, and because we're also getting our children to read earlier, do maths earlier than they need to. They don't need to be doing maths and phonics and things before the age of 3 because that's left hemispheric skills. So we're then stopping the gross motor skills from developing because we're reading to them too young. Our children need to play for longer. And that's those gross motor skills, which is developing the right hemisphere first. Now those gross motor skills then go on to the left hemispheres, and then the left and the right hemisphere will develop together. We're now in a world where, poor Peppa Pig, I do take it out on Peppa Pig, but our children are watching Peppa Pig too long, which is growing left hemisphere skills too quickly. We don't need our children in front of screens.
It's preventing them from gaining these gross motor skills because you can't develop gross motor skills, and they're the foundations to social, emotional, and behavioral regulation. So you can't develop them if you're switching on parts of regions of the brain that are switching on too early. And then what's happening, it's going to prevent you from switching on the way the brain was designed to develop. And I just think, the environment is drastically changing at speeds where it's engaging kids more.
It's really important to get that message across that it is obviously the blueprint and the sequences, but that as a major sequence there, that you should be focusing certain skills and teaching your child or encouraging your child to do certain activities, but during the first 3 years of life versus after that, not trying to learn to read too quickly, not trying to walk before they can crawl. That's important. The sort of crawling before you walk as a milestone in a development, but also the order in which you teach bigger skills, fine motor versus gross motor, more analytical and reading and writing versus more imaginative play and that side of things. So that carries a lot of importance.
Well, if you look at kids with the labels, let's say ADHD, autism, a lot of them are very left hemispherically driven. So you go, a lot of them are quite mature in the genius level skills of the left hemisphere. So the more advanced skills in the left hemisphere. When you look at individuals with dyslexia, they really struggle academically. They lack the left hemispheric skills. They're more gross motor skills, but they might have missed certain sequences, or they may have reflexes still unintegrated, hence, but it doesn't mean that they can never access these left hemispheric regions. There is nothing damaged or broken in the brain preventing them from developing these skills. And I think that's important, but they both should be in sync. They should be rhythmically connecting with one another. And, you know, if a child is able to read words, but then also the other hemisphere, the right hemisphere, allows them to explain what the words mean. Because in the beginning, the child doesn't understand what the words mean, hence gross motor skills. So then we go at 6, and it almost like does this overlapping in stages, which I spoke about.
It flip-flops
in the
as well,
beginning,
with left and right and overlapping, yeah.
Absolutely, but also in terms of the neuro sort of genesis, in terms of the migration, you know, the neuronal migration, in terms of the synaptogenesis, in terms of myelination. So it has these overlapping stages across bottom up, lateralization, top down. And that's how the brain communicates, through this wiring. That's what we call synaptic connections and myelination. Now think of it like electrical signals. The thicker the myelination the coating of the axons, the metal wire, let's say, the quicker that signal goes. And the only way you can create that thicker myelination is through repetition. So whatever you rep, in a sense, whatever you act out, whatever you think, that's all repetition. Whatever you consume in terms of nutrition is repetition of behavior. And that's
Crucial.
ultimately what creates these electrical signals to signal quicker. It's not that you're incapable of developing these other skills. With most of these individuals who have never had any brain injuries or anything, but we're pathologizing, we're creating problems that are not problems. I feel.
And if we're repping the wrong skills at the wrong time,
then we develop the wrong skills.
Then that's going to lead to
there's a
adverse
consequence.
behaviors. There's a
Then there's a
consequence.
Immaturity in the brain. Then that's what we call immature in the brain. Symptoms of irregulation. That's what we call hyperactivity, focus and concentration. Well, they're symptoms of ADHD. Well, they're antagonistic and agonistic, which means they're total opposites of each other. But what if, Steve, I didn't focus on the hyperactive behavior? What if I focused on developing focus and concentration in the child? Then what does that do to hyperactivity? It reduces it.
Brings it down, yeah.
Absolutely. So we go, there's this amazing system of pairs. That's where we up, down, we have left, right, we have hot and cold. So we have light and dark. The whole universe has a blueprint in pairs. That's how we were created.
Stress and calm.
Absolutely. Parasympathetic, sympathetic.
It really helps to hit home to me and understanding, and you see it in the personality traits of your children specifically. It's like, oh crikey, that's more of a left trait, or that's more of a right trait. And I like to see it that way, but I know it's not as simplistic as left and right and hemispheric. But it's,
it explains it a little bit. It explains it in simpler terms, that the brain has these, the two hemispheres have unique, distinct features. Hence, that's why certain brain regions develop at this stage and others develop at this stage. And if you get them first 6-7 years right, the foundations right, the child tends to sort of traject on the same curve, unless something terrible happens, and they lose a father or mother instantly. That's trauma, God forbid, but it does happen. Then what will happen is the child's brain will go into protection and survival, which will then unlock and unintegrate these primitive reflexes again, because it goes into reflexive states, and then you tend to see the withdrawal behaviors again, the fight and flight, or the outbursts. And there's a reason why the brain does it, but it's only there to keep you alive and to reproduce, because we're an organism. That's its priority. But it's important we recognize the blueprint of brain development. I think it's really important for parents to understand it as well, because I like to understand it.
Yeah, it's a super
And
important.
we can see it. We can test our children as well, can't we? It's very clear to see which side of the brain they're more dominant with, because the left controls the right side of the body, the right controls the left, and that's the same with hearing and smelling. Smelling is
Smells the same.
Smells the only one that's different.
Yeah.
But if I feel like my child is heavily left brain dominant, that they should be able to balance on their right side better. Is that true?
Say that again, Steve.
If I feel like my child is left brain dominant, they should be stronger right-sided with balance.
Yes, absolutely, yeah, because it's this cross-lateralization. So, yeah, right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, yeah. And most of us, like you'll see with individuals with dyslexia, let's say, they may have primitive reflex, but because they have such gross motor skills, good gross motor skills, some of them don't have any unintegrated reflexes, but what they do have is this sensory imbalance. So you tend to see one eye which is stronger, but one ear which is stronger, which is all commonly the opposite, or one ear isn't taking information in as well as what the eye is. So it causes this confusion between the sensory communication between the eyes, what they see and what they hear. So in the classroom, when the teacher's talking to them, looking at the blackboard, trying to copy, they tend to struggle and they copy the wrong thing because they're trying to listen, because there's one eye and it depends how they're sat and so that. But that all has a huge influence in terms of how the brain regions develop.
And we're looking at tracking with things like that as well, so aren't we? Eye tracking correctly.
Yeah, convergence, divergence. You can see with the eyes, if the right eye is diverging when you're asking him to watch a target, then we tend to see lower levels of logical thinking and individuals who really struggle to plan strategically. If you see a right eye that deviates, then you tend to see the individual who really struggles with behavioral consequences, a lot more the sort of criminals or the ones who really struggle to regulate, because they're unable to inhibit certain behaviors, and they also lack empathy as well. So there's always this amazing correlation between our senses and how they're performing and our brain regions in behavior. They're all linked. You can't separate them. It's how the brain was stimulated to grow, was when it came into the world. That's why it can't develop synaptic connections and myelination when it's in the gestation period fully. It has to be stimulated through the senses, which projects then onto the motor cortex, which is behaviors.
That's a really important concept, actually. Like empathy is a huge attribute and a huge thing in children that may be missing, and that resides more in the right side of the brain, for example. So if a child is really heavily left brain dominant, they might lack empathy.
Yes.
And so it's a challenge to try and increase.
They're motivated, Steve. They're motivated. They're goal orientated. So anything that gets in the goal, I don't have any empathy for, because they don't have the ability to inhibit, because the right hemisphere see it as a braking mechanism. The left hemisphere see it as the accelerator. So even when you get a virus, let's say, the left hemisphere stimulates the white blood cells and the right hemisphere says, you've dealt with the white blood cells, let's relax. Let's put a break on it. Well, if you don't have enough right hemisphere, it's not just a case of I'm inhibiting behavior. The immune system turns on itself, so you end up with more autoimmune problems, more food sensitivities with the ones who are more left hemispherically dominant.
Okay.
So this is purely neurological.
And the strategies to balance out the left and the right?
Movement, incredible, absolutely. Environment.
Is it a case of strengthening up, physically strengthening up one side?
Sympathetic, reflex integration, nutrition, they're all important in order to balance out the right and left.
So I don't need to focus on that, learning more skills that are right-sided, or focus on strengthening the right side of my body.
It depends if they're more dominant. Yeah, if they're far more dominant, Steve, where they lack the inhibition and emotional regulation, then you would have to then focus more on stimulating that left side of the body to get the right hemisphere regions up to skill. to balance out, or you because you want to create some pruning in the left hemisphere because it's far more overstimulated. Yeah.
So that's when we say the body and the brain are so comorbid in
It's just connected to the same
So
thing.
it's
Yeah.
wired
Same thing.
together.
that you can actually improve the right side of your brain and the way you think, and improve empathy by concentrating on upskilling the
Yeah.
left side of your body, the left
Yeah.
eye, the certain parts of your vision.
So you could put a patch on your right eye if it's much stronger. So what you do is you slowly inhibit certain sides of the body in order for the more dominant regions, the more underdeveloped regions to then develop. You would just slowly switch off certain senses. You'd put an earbud in the ear, for instance, and you would stimulate more sound. But the type of sounds we also hear has an impact on left and right as well. So more the sequential sounds, the rhythmic, the beat sounds are more left hemispherically driven. So you would just put an earbud in that ear, in the opposite ear, and you would stimulate more rhythmic sounds if they're underdeveloped, like dyslexia, in the left hemisphere. Yeah.
And these therapies, I think we'll get into the detail of each one of these therapies and how they work. And
but going back
what
to
their
left and
role
right
is.
hemispheres, we work in elite supporting environments. Sometimes we can put some of our children onto side planks, for example, and they'll go on their right arm and they're super strong on their right arm, for example, in a side plank. You flip them over and put them on their left arm, they're all over the place. So we know that that's not just necessarily a muscular thing, that's a neurological thing. So we've got to upskill both sides of that body. So again, if you're stronger on that right one, you keep doing a little bit, but you certainly do more on the other side to strengthen up the other side. So that's from a physical and a musculoskeletal point of view, but more importantly, from a neurological point of view. So the benefits of that are way more than just a physical presence. They're a neurological balance.
Well, also balancing on one leg, Steve. If there's deviations with the sensory input of the feet, how is the brain reading the body? So, the psychological therapy is a top-down approach, but I think working together with us and them will be much more powerful than just treating mental health or developmental disorders purely as a psychological or with a pill, let's say. Although the pill may serve the most distressed in society, we don't want to deter from that, but it's then trying to get them to understand these different domains that allow this blueprint of the brain to develop in the most healthiest of ways.
And is it true that if a sign of maybe some neurological challenges would be that a child has different strengths on different sides of the body? So left foot is stronger, right arm is stronger, and it flip-flops around. Are you trying to, train a child to be more balanced with, strong in both sides rather than flip-flopping either side?
Ideally, Steve, well, think about it. If the communication between, say, for instance, I see with the right eye, but I hear with the left eye better, the signals, remember the synaptogenesis, the signals and the myelination takes longer to communicate. So they process information, it takes them longer. Whereas if it's right eye and right ear, the connections are quicker. So they're able to comprehend information much quicker.
Yeah.
That would make sense because they're traveling to the other regions of the, parietal lobes, let's say. Or the temporal lobes. There has to be a longer signal that has to travel. So information processes longer, it takes longer. So then the goal would be either to create more repetition so the signal can travel faster, so then they can comprehend the information. Or the goal would be to say, because you're young, let's get these in order and get them, because the firing of the signal is quicker. So you develop comprehension quicker, let's say, or you develop emotional regulation and behavior much quicker.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Of course it makes sense. It's the blueprint of brain science.
And it's never going to change.
We're just, well, look, I remember Joseph Babinski reading an article on him with the Babinski response in 1985. And you go, well, this information has been known for a very long time. But as a parent, Stephen, you as a parent, were you ever told about the importance of primitive reflexes and how movement helps integrate and develops the foundation of this brain. I certainly wasn't.
Nope.
And my child has Down syndrome, and I wasn't even told. And they would test more on her, but I was still never explained about what tests they were doing and why they would stroke the feet or why they would stroke the back. None of that. But if you don't look for this information, I just think you're putting yourself at a huge disadvantage.
But once you start looking, and what it opens up is unbelievable. And you talk
you're
about,
in,
what
you're
if you
in.
could improve that? I didn't realize you could improve the left hearing versus the right hearing, or it made a difference, or the left foot versus right foot. And then it's like, well, if you can start improving that, and that makes a massive impact on the way you see the world and your behavior and your quality of life, then what else can you improve? What else are you born with? What else can you upskill? And I think those are the other conversations we're going to have about what you're born with, what you can develop and create, and nature versus nurture, and all of that are all concepts that we want to cover off and give us all a level of positivity about what we can achieve in life, and what our children can achieve as well.
Absolutely. I think that's the key, isn't it? Especially with all the information that's going around in the world and the limitation that is being put on individuals as well. I just think we've got an absolute duty to make sure our kids have access to this information. And we want them to live and access their full potential. And we've got a moral obligation to make sure they do that.
Great. Well, I think there's a show in there somewhere, boys. I'm sure we can edit that down. We talked a little bit longer than we wanted, but we'll condense it and we'll move on. Start talking some more, getting that message across next week. But amazing conversation as always. I think we should leave it there.
Yep, awesome. Seb, brilliant, man.
There you go. Brilliant, guys.
Cheers, Seb.
Lovely to see you as always.